All right, so Stockfish 13 is out. Just came out in the last 2 days, so it's free to download on their site. So this is the latest and greatest engine, and it's getting a lot of interesting reviews online. And there are a couple YouTube videos out already by people analyzing some games, and it looks like it's producing some very different results to its predecessor and also to Leela chess as well. So we'll see how this goes. So let's look at a game from this morning. I'm playing white again with the English opening, and this game didn't last long. And let's see what Stockfish thinks about it. So I open with c4. Opponent does e6, and I go into my fianchetto system, and he comes in with d5. So I go bishop to g2, knight to f6. So he's playing very top line moves, and now b to e7. And let's turn the engine on and see what's happening. Okay, so Stockfish 13 on for the first time. So top line moves here d4 and castle. So I decide to go with castle. Comes in with nb to d7, which was I thought a bit of a strange move, but he's aiming for a c5 system here, something like a Queen's Indian defense, but I hadn't really seen this. So in this case, I do decide to get into the center with d4, thinking that this is still the English opening, but a favorable setup for me. And you can see here that normal moves here would be castle by him and maybe even c6. Now that the knight has come to here, we don't have to worry about blocking our knight on c6, but instead he goes for a really offbeat move with b6. And I did feel at this point that I should have been able to take advantage of this, but for whatever reason, I wasn't able to. So we look at the engine suggestions. So with the fianchetto, obviously knight to e5 is always a potential. So it it was suggesting that any e5 could be in. Obviously, this weakness here means that capturing here wouldn't be possible because the rook is exposed. I also had the option of taking on d5, and had we done that, let's just look at that. So knight takes d5 and pawn takes d5 both ways, because if the knight were to recapture, I would just simply get in e4. Then I had queen to a4, and so this pawn is moved out pretty slowly. This bishop can no longer come to d7, and his king is still not castled. So we had a good attack in the center here. We go back to this point. So instead, I went with n to c3 as a developing move. So game remains about even, and he goes into his fianchetto. And now again, game evaluation showing about even, but we really could have played any e5 again here, and that bishop is still, of course, vulnerable because it's not protected on b7. So I go into b3 just to protect, and now I've really lost the advantage of the game. So he comes in with c5, which is a good controlling move in the center. And in this case, the engine did like the capture actually on c5, and that was an interesting one. I guess its feeling is that this is a little bit vulnerable here. I did think that the capture on c5 would just simply allow him to develop, so the bishop would move twice, which would be a negative, but he could get in pretty easily. So that's sort of why I turned that down. But d takes c5 may be preferable here. So I just developed the bishop into central control, and now the evaluation is showing that I'm actually slightly worse. So rook to c8, a good developing move on his part. But now, what seems like a good developing move, now again we can play c takes d, and in this case, we would capture on d, so c takes d, and then if the pawn were to recapture, we would have what it was suggesting was nh4. So it continues to want to get this influence of the bishop into the game. So that's an interesting way of approaching it. We could also play d takes c5, which it likes as well. And let's say the pawn, well, I think he would develop. It can recapture all three ways, but it's suggesting the best is maybe, seems like the best is maybe knight takes, which makes sense because it would have control over the central squares. But if that knight moves away, then there's the chance for us to play n to b5 as well. So now the bishops are about to have very, very strong central control. And of course, this pawn is vulnerable too. So if we go back to the game, I played rook to e1 just as a developing move to come into the center. And it doesn't like that either, because now it's free to capture. So I think with these pawns interacting on the C and D files, the engine's pointing out that I really should have taken the opportunity to capture. So he actually doesn't, and somewhat lets me off the hook. And I wanted a developing move because that's what I'm trying to focus in the opening, but I should have played again C takes D5. So instead I play R to C1, B takes, I just simply recapture with B going into the center and adding influence over the D5 square. So then he just recaptures there, and then I had to think about what to do, and I played N to B5, and what it was suggesting was that I should have just simply immediately recaptured with the queen, and then the queen, of course, would allow control over these central squares, even though it can get hit pretty easily with things. Obviously, I looked at bishop to C5, which would have been bad, and I guess at this point it likes a move to here, but it evaluates me as slightly worse than this position. So the recapture with the queen would have been preferable. Instead, I play N to B5, thinking that I could come back into the center, also hitting this pawn, but this pawn wasn't really the focus because I'm trying to focus on the center. But then he simply finds he actually had a better move in B to B4, and so that would have hit the rook, which I actually didn't see, and he didn't either. B to B4 hits this rook, and we would really basically have to go back to F1. It's also suggesting that we could play, so it's just simply R to F1. So terrible move coming off the line, and then we couldn't even kick it out because without the B pawn, A3 is no good because it would just go back to, or it could go back to A5 or to C5. So that was a miss there too. So NB takes D4. I thought this was decent coming back into the center, but Stockfish 13 evaluating me down about a pawn at this point, and comes to C5. Very good developing move. So the queen now has control over the D file, and the knight now has control over the white squares, and as a defensive move, E6 as well. So good move on his part. And to E5, I thought this would make sense to come into the center with the idea that it does now offer up the bishop, but I did this with the idea that this knight would be a strong controlling force in the center. So he plays NC to E4, and I knew right away that there's no way this should be captured because we'd lose our good bishop. He would easily get his knight to a good square, and then be able to develop this bishop, which is on E7 and not so effective there. So here I played F3, but that seems to be a pretty serious mistake. So something like even queen to C2, which is a little hard to see because it's in the path of the rook. But top suggestion is queen to C2, which would attack E4, but it's protected twice. So that's a bit of a tough one to see. Bishop goes to D6, good developing move, and attacking my knight. And here's where I make a pretty bad mistake. I come back to D3, thinking that I have control over these central squares, which was a good idea. But what's beginning to happen is this knight has become vulnerable, and retreating moves are generally not good. So that was something to watch. So he does N to C5, which was the top move. And so now I just thought, okay, if I'm off that file, we should immediately play E4, threatening these two minor pieces. So if I can get to this square, that would be a potential problem for these two minor pieces, and controlling the center with the idea of just simply controlling D5. So then I do play E4, and at this point, Stockfish 13 is evaluating me down about a pawn. He takes on D3, and this is where I got into quite a bad pin. So I take on D3, and again, still just down a pawn, but now bishop to C5, and What was essential was I didn't realize that I was backing this up twice and we had to prevent this push of e5. So I just completely missed this. So I I play king to h1, which loses the game on the spot. So at this point, the saving move is e5, but I'm still down about a pawn. So I had to find this, which I didn't. It's actually a very good move because the knight does not have these two central squares to go into. So these are both not good for him because of the pawn control of those squares. But instead, I played just to go back a step. I played king to h1, and that loses on the spot. So now about a 5 pawn deficit because he simply plays e5. And so on e5, this just loses the game because now this knight is lost because the queen, of course, is hanging, right? So I can't move the knight because the queen will just simply recapture down here, and the knight will be lost as well to this pawn. So interesting. So Stockfish 13's out, and it should provide some very interesting analysis. I'm already hearing from some other analysis that, like in the Sicilian game, I saw a game mentioned where it it's showing very different evaluations to what was previously thought and what the engines had previously come up with. So it'll be very interesting to see what it comes up with.